The police officer said I was under arrest for trespassing on HOA property. Right there, on my own driveway. His voice was flat. The kind of voice that had delivered the same line hundreds of times before. His gloved hand rested on the cold metal of the handcuffs, while I stood frozen, my feet glued to the scorching concrete of a summer afternoon. The smell of hot asphalt rose thick and dry, as if the ground itself was tense along with me. Behind the officer, Brandy Lockridge stood with her arms crossed over her chest. Her white dress was perfectly pressed, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, her eyes gleaming with something hard to name. She smiled. Not the polite smile of a neighbor. It was the smile of someone who believed she had just put an end to another person. "I warned you, Caleb," she said, her voice sweet like honey, but sharp like a blade. "Those solar panels look absolutely awful. No one wants to see trash like that dragging down property values in Cedar Ridge Estates." The officer glanced at me, hesitation flickering in his eyes, but his hand never left the cuffs. He cleared his throat and explained that the Homeowners Association had filed a formal complaint, that I refused to comply with community rules, that I was deliberately in violation. I felt my jaw tighten. My throat burned, dry and tight. "Which HOA?" I asked, my voice low and slow. "I am not part of her association." Brandy let out a small laugh, quiet but overflowing with confidence. "Anyone who lives in Cedar Ridge follows our rules. No exceptions. You do not get to stand outside of them." I stood there, a 50-year-old man in a faded t-shirt, hands still rough from 30 years of industrial electrical work, being looked at like some stubborn country fool daring to defy the order of things. In Brandy's eyes, I saw more than contempt. I saw absolute certainty. She believed she was right. She believed the power was on her side. The officer told me to turn around. I took a deep breath. In that moment, I thought of my grandfather, of the old wooden house at the edge of Maple Hollow, of the smell of pipe tobacco and the creak of floorboards every time he stood up. He used to say, in the calm voice of a man who had lived long enough to understand the world, "Never sell everything. Always keep what others will one day need." I reached slowly toward my back pocket, making sure the officer could see every movement. He tensed, but he did not stop me. I pulled out an old piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age, sealed inside a thin plastic sleeve. I held it up in the heavy heat, under the stunned stares of the two people in front of me. "Before you put those cuffs on," I said, my voice strangely calm, "you might want to take a look at this." Brandy frowned. For the first time, her smile faltered. It was the property deed. My family's name printed clearly across it. The boundary description stretched on, covering the very road we were standing on. This driveway, the land Brandy had just called community property. The officer bent closer to read. He took his time. I watched his expression shift from rigid to uncertain, then to something close to confusion. Brandy stepped forward. "That is impossible," she said quickly, her voice rising. "This is common land. The developer set it aside for the community." "I know," I replied. "They bought most of my grandfather's land years ago, but not all of it." The wind moved through the street, carrying the rustle of leaves from the maple trees at the corner. No one spoke for several seconds. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow but heavy, like a hammer striking steel. I saw a flash of irritation in Brandy's eyes. She was not used to the story drifting away from the script she had already written. In her world, people like me did not get to ask questions, let alone flip the table. But I had lived on this land since before Cedar Ridge even had a name. I fixed my neighbors' wiring, walked their dogs, shoveled snow every winter without being asked. I never wanted trouble. I only wanted peace. And because of that, when Brandy decided to make me her target, she had no idea what she had just touched. The officer looked up at me. "Sir," he said, his tone completely changed. "I need to verify this." Brandy opened her mouth to object, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time since I had known her, Brandy Lockridge did not look certain. I looked down the road leading to my home, the road my family had walked for decades. I knew, with absolute clarity, that this was only the beginning, and that the woman standing in front of me, the woman who had just called the police to arrest me, was standing on something she had never truly owned. And I, the man everyone underestimated, was finally ready to show her what real power actually looks like. I was not handcuffed that day, but the rumors spread faster than any patrol car ever could. In just a single afternoon, all of Cedar Ridge was whispering that I was a troublemaker, that I had defied the homeowners association, that I thought I stood above the rules everyone else followed. I felt it the very next morning as I drove my old pickup toward the end of the street. The familiar waves were gone. Neighbors' eyes slid past me as if I were carrying something contagious. I had lived here long enough to understand how heavy silence can be. My house was nothing special. One story, faded paint worn down by years of sun and rain, a porch that creaked whenever the wind blew hard. But it was where my grandfather used to sit every evening, sipping coffee and watching the sun sink behind the maple trees. It was where my father learned how to fix his first lawnmower. And it was where I came back to after 30 years working with high-voltage wires, when my shoulder could no longer handle days spent climbing ladders. I never wanted to be the center of any argument. Brandy Lockridge was different. She arrived in Cedar Ridge like a foreign gust of wind, carrying expensive perfume and very clear ideas about how other people should live. Within her first few months, she went door to door with a small notebook, writing down everything she believed failed to meet her standards. Mailbox colors, grass length, fence styles. When she was elected to the HOA board, I barely noticed. When she became president, I assumed it would pass. I was wrong. It started with my workshop, an old shed that had been there long before Cedar Ridge was ever drawn on a map. Brandy said it looked crude. Then came my vegetable garden. She called it agriculture that did not fit the neighborhood aesthetic. The sound of my table saw on Saturday mornings suddenly became a noise violation. Every time, I gave the same answer, polite and clear. I was not part of her homeowners association. That answer angered Brandy more than any insult ever could. I began to notice the slow change in the neighborhood. A family that once asked me to fix their electrical outlet now closed their windows when I walked by. A neighbor who had trusted me to watch their dog now turned away in the grocery store. No one said anything directly, but everyone understood. Brandy had said something, and people believed her. That evening, I sat alone on my porch, listening to the steady hum of insects in the dark. I thought about the people who had left Cedar Ridge over the past few years. The Rivera family, forced to remove their son's basketball hoop because it hurt curb appeal. Mrs. Lynn Tran, warned repeatedly about the smell of her cooking every afternoon. That was when I realized this was not just about me. I was simply the next one. The next morning, I drove to the county records office, an old building painted a pale beige, filled with the mixed scent of paper and stale coffee. The woman behind the counter wore thick glasses and spoke with the tired voice of someone who had done this job her entire life. When she typed my family's name into the system, she stopped. "Oh," she said quietly. "This is interesting." I stood there, my heart beating just a little faster. She printed page after page, stacking them into a thick pile. Boundary maps, purchase agreements, small parcels circled in red ink, scattered through Cedar Ridge like forgotten chess pieces. I recognized my name appearing again and again in places I had never really paid attention to before. I took the stack home and spread it across my kitchen table. Under the glow of an old yellow light, everything slowly came into focus. My grandfather had not only kept the house, he had kept the points the entire neighborhood depended on: the community center, the children's playground, the stormwater retention pond, the mailbox cluster where everyone gathered each morning. All of it sat on land owned by my family. I sat there in silence for a long time. Not because I was happy, but because I understood what this meant. Brandy Lockridge was not just enforcing rules. She was standing on something she did not own, giving orders as if it belonged to her. My phone vibrated. Brandy's name lit up the screen. "Caleb," her voice said, confident as always. I have gathered enough signatures to ask the county to force you into HOA compliance. This is no longer personal." End quote. End quote. After was reclassed, intentional. I looked at the stack of papers in front of me. At the boundary lines no one had bothered to read closely before. "I understand," I replied. "You should do whatever you think is right." She hung up, satisfied. I smiled, just slightly, because while she believed she was tightening her grip on power, I had just discovered that the entire stage she had been performing on, from beginning to end, had always belonged to me. The morning I installed the solar panels on my roof, Brandy Lockridge walked into my yard as if she owned the sky above my head. No knocking, no greeting, just the sharp click of high heels striking concrete, and her shadow stretching across my porch, like a sentence being handed down. In her hand was the thick leather-bound notebook she carried on every violation hunt. She stopped in the middle of my driveway and looked up at my roof, where metal frames reflected the morning sun. "You are not allowed to do this," she said, her voice loud and clear as if she were reading from sacred law. "Any structural modification must be approved by the homeowners association." I stood on the ladder, sweat running down my back, my hand still gripping a wrench. I looked down and met her eyes. In that moment, I saw the familiar anger in Brandy's gaze, the kind that surfaced whenever someone dared to say no. "I am not part of your association," I said. One sentence. Short, clear. Brandy smiled, cold and certain. "Anyone who lives in Cedar Ridge belongs to it. You do not get to stand outside the rules." I climbed down the ladder. Each rung creaked dryly beneath my weight. When my feet hit the ground, we stood facing each other, only a few steps apart. I could smell her perfume, sharp and heavy, just like her personality. "This is my house," I said slowly. "I have the paperwork." She flipped open her notebook, pages turning fast as if she knew every line by heart. "Your paperwork does not matter here. The Homeowners Association is responsible for protecting property values. And these," she pointed up at my roof, "make the entire neighborhood look bad." I felt eyes watching from behind curtains. A few neighbors were peeking out. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. The silence only made Brandy more confident. She turned to leave, but tossed one last line over her shoulder. "I will be reporting this to the county. You should prepare yourself." That afternoon, as I was putting my tools away, my phone buzzed. An email from the county office. A formal complaint regarding non-compliant construction within a residential zone. The sender was the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, with Brandy Lockridge's name signed neatly at the bottom. I sat down on the front step and read every line. Each word felt like a small stone dropped into the still surface of my life. But the more I read, the clearer one thing became. Brandy believed she was backing me into a corner. She had no idea I was standing on the edge of something much bigger. The next morning, I drove to the county administrative building. The sky was gray, the clouds low, as if the entire town was holding its breath. The records office sat at the end of a long hallway, beneath flickering fluorescent lights. The woman from before looked up and recognized me immediately. "You again," she said evenly. "I figured you would want a closer look." She pulled out old maps and spread them across the counter. Boundary lines tangled like spider webs. I leaned in, tracing the faded ink with my eyes. Each time she tapped a spot with her pen, my heart beat a little harder. "This one," she said, tapping lightly, "belongs to your family." I looked. It was the land where the Homeowners Association had built the community center. "And this," she continued, "the mailbox cluster." I swallowed. "And here is the playground. And the stormwater retention pond." I straightened up, my head spinning. The places Brandy called common property. The spaces where she issued orders, fines, and threats. Every single one of them sat on land my grandfather had deliberately kept. The clerk looked at me with something close to sympathy. "A lot of people do not read contracts carefully," she said. "Your grandfather did." When my stilled at it. I took the stack of papers home in silence. I spread them across my kitchen table under the glow of an old yellow light. I could see my grandfather again, sitting at that same table, carefully signing page after page. He was not a man of many words, but every decision he made had purpose. My phone buzzed again. "Brandy." "Caleb," she said, her voice bright with confidence. "We have filed a formal complaint. The county will handle this soon. You cannot win this." I looked at the maps in front of me, at the parcels of land Cedar Ridge depended on every single day. "I understand," I replied. "Let them handle it." She hung up, certain she was in control. I remained seated alone in the quiet kitchen, feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear. It was the calm of someone who had just realized that his opponent was standing on a stage he owned, and that the performance was about to enter an act they were completely unprepared for. That morning, orange flags appeared all across Cedar Ridge, and the entire neighborhood seemed to wake up to a truth no one had expected. I stood on my porch, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, watching the survey crew's pickup roll slowly through the internal road. The lead surveyor stepped out, wearing a worn hard hat, carrying shiny measuring equipment, and a bag filled with bright orange painted stakes. He shook my hand with a firm grip, the eyes of a man more accustomed to land than to people. "I will walk every inch," he said. "Nothing gets missed." That was the moment I knew everything had shifted into a different phase. No more arguments back and forth. No more vague complaints and paperwork. These were real boundaries, measured with coordinates, metal, and paint. We started at my driveway. The equipment beeped steadily. An orange stake was driven into the ground. Then another. And another. Along the edge of the road, around the lawn, beside the community center, where Brandy had once stood in front of hundreds of people lecturing them about standards. She appeared less than 10 minutes later. I saw Brandy through the window. The curtain in her house twitched slightly. Then the door flew open. She stepped outside, no longer in high heels, but in spotless white sneakers. Her face tight with tension she could not hide. "What do you think you are doing?" she shouted, moving quickly toward us. The surveyor did not look at her. He kept writing, his hand steady, his voice even, surveying property boundaries at the request of the landowner. Brandy turned to me. Her eyes sharpened. "Caleb, what is this about?" I shrugged. "Just making sure I know exactly where my land ends." She let out a short laugh, but it cracked in the open air. "You are wasting money. Everyone knows these parcels are common areas." The surveyor stopped and turned to face her. His expression was cool and neutral. "The documents say otherwise." Brandy froze, just for a second. Then she raised her voice again. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I know the boundaries here." The surveyor looked at me, waiting for confirmation. I nodded. He turned back to his work. 3 hours passed slowly, like drops of molten asphalt. Orange flags sprouted everywhere. In front of the community center, around the children's playground, along the edge of the retention pond, and around the mailbox cluster where neighbors gathered every morning to chat, laugh, and complain about their electric bills. I watched Brandy pacing inside her house, her phone glued to her ear. At times she frowned. At times she shook her head. At times she stared outside with disbelief in her eyes. When the surveyor finished packing up, he walked over to me. "Your grandfather," he said quietly. "Either a genius or unbelievably lucky." "Why is that?" I asked. He glanced around and pointed toward the familiar structures. He kept every point that makes a neighborhood function. Without these, everything falls apart. That evening, I sat alone on my porch as a cool breeze passed through. The orange flags reflected the sunset, looking like warning signs. I was not celebrating. I was thinking about the families who used those amenities every day without knowing, thinking about how this truth, once fully revealed, would shake all of Cedar Ridge. My phone buzzed. "Brandy, what are you trying to pull?" she demanded, her voice urgent, no longer confident. "Just confirming boundaries," I replied. "Is there a problem?" "There is," she said quickly. You are causing panic. People keep calling me." I looked at the orange flags, standing motionless in the evening light. The truth usually causes panic at first. She was silent for a few seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, tighter. "Do you think this gives you power?" I paused before answering. "No. It just gives me the truth." She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat for a long time, listening to insects and the wind moving through the trees. I understood I was standing at a crossroads. I could reveal everything immediately and flip the board over, or I could wait. I chose to wait, because sometimes the best way to deal with someone who is used to giving orders is to let them keep believing they are in control, while each orange stake out there quietly redraws the entire map of power in the neighborhood. The yellow citation tucked under the windshield wiper appeared on my driveway like a declaration of war. I discovered it on a windy afternoon, just as my nephew had parked his old car beside my pickup. He walked into the house looking confused, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, as if he had done something wrong. The bold print at the top stated a parking violation for guest vehicles within Cedar Ridge Estates. I looked at the paper, then at the driveway, then back at my nephew. "I parked on your land," he said quietly, as if he needed reassurance. "I know," I replied. Heavy footsteps sounded behind us. Brandy Lockridge was striding toward us, clipboard in hand, posture straight and fast, like an officer entering an inspection. Her eyes slid past me, landed on the car, then returned, lit with a satisfaction she barely bothered to hide. "Guest parking violation," she said. "Section 4.7. Visitors must use designated areas." "This is my driveway," I replied evenly. "Not a shared parking zone." Brandy tilted her head, her smile thin as a blade. "This entire area falls under HOA authority, including private spaces, if they are within Cedar Ridge boundaries." My nephew looked at me, eyes wide. He did not understand what was happening. I did. This was no longer about aesthetics or regulations. This was about asserting power at any cost. "So you are claiming you have the authority to ticket a car parked on private land?" I asked. "Community land," she corrected instantly. "We do this for the common good." I took out my phone and turned on the camera, not as a threat, just to record. "Could you say that again?" I asked. Brandy hesitated for a split second, then regained her confidence. "The Homeowners Association has the authority to manage all areas within Cedar Ridge to protect property values." She turned and walked away, heading toward her polished luxury car, the stride of someone who believed she had just won another small battle. That night, I sat in my kitchen under the yellow glow of the light above a wooden table scarred by years of use. I thought about my 30 years as an electrician. I had met people who believed they understood the law better than the tradesmen, people who thought speaking louder and longer could push the truth aside. They were usually the ones who caused the most dangerous accidents. I decided I would not argue with words anymore. The next day, I installed my first security cameras. Nothing expensive, just clear enough to record what happened on my land. One facing the driveway, one aimed at the vegetable garden, one covering the edge near the playground. The first week, the cameras captured more than I expected. On the first night, close to midnight, Brandy appeared at the edge of my property, dumping a bag of yard waste onto my side. She looked around, then left quickly, like a shadow. On the third night, her family's trailer used my grass to turn around, tires tearing long tracks through the lawn. No permission, no hesitation. On the fifth night, I saw Brandy step into my vegetable garden, a measuring tape in her hand, bending down to measure each row, her face tight, as if calculating something important. I reviewed each clip slowly, not angry, just taking note. But on the seventh night, the camera captured something that made me freeze the frame. Brandy appeared after full dark, a baseball cap pulled low. In her hand was a can of green spray paint. She walked up to the bright orange survey stakes the crew had placed around my land. Without hesitation, she crouched and sprayed over the vivid orange until the markers blended into the color of the night grass. I sat upright in my chair. My heart pounded. Not from fear, from certainty. She was trying to erase the boundary lines. The next morning, I timed my walk to the mailbox perfectly. Brandy was there too, arms full of envelopes, her face drawn with fatigue. When she saw me, she started to turn away. "Sleep well?" I asked. She stopped and looked at me with irritation. "I am busy." "I bet you are," I said, then held up my phone and played the video. The screen clearly showed her in the night, spray can in hand, each survey marker disappearing under green paint. Brandy's face drained of color. Her hands trembled as she held the mail. "Do you know what tampering with survey markers is called?" I asked quietly. "In many places, it is a serious crime." She did not answer. She turned and walked away quickly, heading for her house, as if the ground were burning beneath her feet. I stood there in the quiet morning of Cedar Ridge and understood that Brandy Lockridge had crossed a line she could not step back from. And this time, everything had been recorded. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar county number, and I knew Brandy had chosen to hit harder. The man's voice on the other end was dry, the voice of a civil servant who had heard too many complaints. He introduced himself as a building inspector and informed me that the county office had received a report accusing me of operating illegal commercial activity in a residential zone. According to the complaint, I was allegedly performing electrical work for neighbors in exchange for profit, in violation of Cedar Ridge zoning regulations. I stood inside my workshop, the scent of freshly cut wood still hanging in the air. My hand rested on the scarred workbench, feeling the grain beneath my skin. After 30 years in the trade, I was used to baseless accusations. But this time, I understood the intention behind it. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "We need to inspect," he replied. "Tomorrow, 2 in the afternoon." I ended the call and sat down on the old wooden chair. Outside, Cedar Ridge remained as quiet as ever. Children rode their bikes. Adults mowed their lawns. No one knew that a paper war was tightening its grip. That evening, I called Nina Alvarez. I had heard her name through an old friend in construction. A land use attorney, sharp, known for showing no mercy to people who confused imagined authority with real legal power. When I finished telling her the story, there was a brief silence on the line. "You did one thing right," Nina said. "You documented everything. Versi. For on down. But now they are pulling the county into this," I replied. Nina let out a soft laugh. "Good. When the government steps in, everything has to rely on paperwork. And I have a feeling the paperwork is on your side." We agreed to meet the next morning before the inspector arrived. Nina's office was on the second floor of an old building, filled with the rich smell of coffee and leather. She spread my documents across the table, every map, every camera clip, every property deed. When I played the video of Brandy spray painting the survey markers, Nina looked up at me, her eyes sharpened. She backed herself into a corner, Nina said. "Tampering with survey markers is a very serious offense. She will say it was a misunderstanding," I replied. "A misunderstanding does not erase video," Nina said firmly. "But I want you to do one more thing." She pulled out a list. Public records requests, HOA financials, permits, maintenance contracts, insurance policies. "They have built and operated a lot of things on your land," Nina said. "If they spent money on it, there will be a trail." That afternoon, the inspector arrived right on time. He came with a thin folder and a cautious expression. I walked him through the house and the workshop, showed him utility bills, my retirement paperwork, proof that I did not charge anyone for electrical help. "You help neighbors," he said, "but there are no financial transactions." "That's right," I replied. "I just don't like seeing outlets burn." He nodded and took notes. Before he left, I handed him another stack of documents. "If you are looking for unauthorized commercial activity," I said, "you might want to look at this." He opened it. Maps, invoices, HOA expense reports for the community center, the playground, the retention pond, all of it located on my land. I watched his expression change. No longer the look of a man inspecting a reported homeowner. It was the look of someone who had just stumbled onto a much larger story. "These facilities," he said slowly, "how long have they been operating?" "Nearly 20 years, I replied. He exhaled quietly. "I think your attorney should contact us." When the door closed behind him, I stood alone in the yard, feeling the afternoon breeze move through the trees. Brandy had tried to use the government to force me to bow. What she did not realize was that every escalation left a trace, and those traces were beginning to form a very clear picture. That evening, Nina called back. Her voice was calm, but I could hear absolute focus behind every word. "Caleb," she said, "your homeowners association has spent a very large amount of money on assets they do not own, and they have been doing it for years." I closed my eyes, thinking of Brandy, the meetings, the threats, the yellow citations. "What are we talking about here?" I asked. "This is not just a neighbor dispute," Nina replied. "This is a mistake that could collapse the entire power structure she is standing on. Indifference. Undernauer." I opened my eyes and looked out at Cedar Ridge sinking into the evening light. For the first time since this all began, I no longer felt like I was being chased. Now I was standing still, and the storm was turning back toward the person who had created it. The old contract slipped out of a dust-covered shoebox and made me drop down onto the attic floor. The paper had turned a deep yellow, the edges curled as if it had survived too many damp winters. On the cover, my grandfather's handwriting stood out clearly, slow and deliberate, so careful it felt carved rather than written. Cedar Ridge Development. Important. My heart started beating faster as I opened the first page. Dust lifted into the air, and the smell of aged paper mixed with rotting wood pulled me back to afternoons spent listening to him talk about war and farmland. I read every line, very slowly. And then I understood why my grandfather always said that people can take many things from you, but no one can take what is written in ink and signed with experience. The Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association did not own the land. They had only been granted temporary use, an easement with a time limit, 25 years, with conditions, with obligations, with penalties. I looked at the expiration date. It was not far away. I carried the stack of papers down to the kitchen and set them beside the files Nina had helped me collect. Numbers began lining up neatly in my head like the final pieces on a chessboard. Repair costs, maintenance expenses, insurance payments, all of it spent on structures sitting on my land, labeled as community property. But according to the contract, the HOA was responsible for keeping everything in good condition, to the satisfaction of the landowner, not to their own standards, to the landowner's standards. I went outside just as the sky began to darken. I took a flashlight and walked the land Cedar Ridge still believed was shared. The basketball court was cracked, long fractures running through it like old wounds. The playground was missing safety caps, one swing hanging crooked and squeaking in the wind. The retention pond smelled foul, its surface coated in a dull green layer of algae. I stood there for a long time, not angry, just taking note. When I went back inside, I started counting. 1 violation, 2, 3. I stopped when the number passed 10. Each violation carried a penalty, spelled out clearly in the contract, written in legal language that was cold, precise, and unforgiving. The next morning, I brought everything to Nina's office. She read the contract in silence for a long time. Then she looked up and removed her glasses. "Your grandfather," she said quietly. "He was not just smart, he was thinking further ahead than everyone else at the table." "What does this mean?" I asked. Nina stacked the papers neatly. "It means the HOA has been in breach of contract for years, and you have the right to demand corrections or penalties. Every violation has a price. And if they cannot fix it?" I asked. "You have the right not to renew," Nina replied. "When the easement expires, they either remove everything or negotiate again from the beginning." I thought about Brandy, about the meetings, the threats, the yellow citations tucked under windshields. I thought about the families who had stayed silent because they were afraid of trouble. Do we go public now? I asked. Nina shook her head. Not yet. We build the file. We let them stay confident. When the truth comes out, it has to be strong enough that no one can deny it. In the days that followed, people began knocking on my door. One afternoon, Lynn Tran stood on my porch holding a plate of still warm pastries. She spoke softly, as if afraid the neighbors might hear. She told me about warning letters, about being reprimanded for cooking smells. She handed me a bundle of papers, all carefully saved. Another evening, Eli Rivera came by. He talked about his son's basketball hoop and the endless arguments with the HOA. Then Tessa Park, a young teacher, arrived with an old phone. On it were recordings from HOA meetings. Brandy's voice came through, rigid and authoritative, talking about standards, compliance, and how no one was allowed to stand outside the rules. I listened to every clip. No explanation was needed. Everything connected on its own. Cedar Ridge was not a community. It had become a stage, where one person played the role of leader by feeding on everyone else's fear. That night, I sat alone, looking at the light spilling out from the houses around me. I thought about my grandfather, about the way he signed each page, never rushed, never hesitant. He did not leave me a fortune. He left me something else, timing. And as I closed the thick folder of documents, I knew one thing for certain. Brandy Lockridge still believed she was controlling the game. But she had no idea that the board had reached a point where a single well-placed move could flip everything upside down. And that move was already in my hands. The letter slid through the slot in my front door at dawn, silent like a threat that did not need a signature. A plain white envelope, no logo, no postmark. Just my name written in black ink, the handwriting stiff and hurried. I opened it right there on the doorstep, while dew still clung to the grass. Inside was an emergency meeting notice from the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, with a bold line warning about a crisis in community standards and the risk of falling property values. No greeting, no signature, but I knew exactly who was behind it. Brandy. She was panicking. And when someone who is used to giving orders starts to panic, they usually make their most reckless moves. I drove to Nina's office that same morning. She already had a thick file prepared, stacked neatly on her desk like a verdict waiting to be read. Her expression was calm, but beneath it, I could see focus stretched tight as a drawn wire. "We are there," Nina said. "Do you want them to fix the problems? Or do you want them to pay?" I did not answer right away. I thought about the cracked playground, the foul-smelling retention pond, the children who had grown used to playing in spaces that were neglected. I thought about Lynn Tran quietly wrapping pastries, about Eli Rivera taking down his son's basketball hoop. "I want them to face the truth," I said. "In front of everyone." Nina nodded. She slid another stack of papers across the desk. Notices of contract violations. A list of maintenance failures. Each item numbered, carefully described, tied to a specific clause, and ending with a precise penalty amount. I skimmed them and felt their weight was not just in the ink. "We will send formal notice," Nina said. 30 days to cure the violations or pay the penalties. At the same time, we notify them of your intent not to renew the easement when it expires. "And if they react?" I asked. Nina shrugged. "They will. That part is guaranteed." The reaction came faster than I expected. That same evening, my phone would not stop buzzing. Messages from unfamiliar numbers, questions that were half curious, half panicked. Someone asked if I planned to shut down the playground. Someone else asked whether the community center would be torn down. I answered each person slowly and honestly. I did not threaten. I did not promise. I simply said everything would be handled the right way. Meanwhile, Brandy called an emergency meeting. Tessa Park sent me the recording that very night. Brandy's voice came through the speaker, sharper than I had ever heard it. She talked about threats from selfish individuals, about the need to act quickly to protect the community. Then she made a proposal that caused an uproar in the room. Every household would be required to contribute a special legal fee to fight unreasonable demands from a single private landowner. I stopped the recording there. Not because I was angry, but because I realized Brandy had just pushed herself directly into the spotlight. The next day, she showed up at my door. No sneakers this time. No rushed movements. Brandy wore a tailored business outfit and carried an expensive leather briefcase. Her smile was tight, like something practiced in front of a mirror. "Caleb," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Can we talk?" I invited her into the living room. She sat down, placed the briefcase on the table, and opened it. Inside was a neatly printed, carefully stapled stack of documents. "The HOA is willing to resolve any misunderstandings," she said. "We are offering a payment in exchange for your signature confirming permanent usage rights for the community facilities. Everyone can move on with their lives." I picked up the papers and read slowly. Clauses granting permanent rights. Clauses waiving all claims. Clauses releasing liability for every past violation. Everything was wrapped in smooth language, but the substance beneath was rough and greedy. "Have you read the original contract?" I asked. Brandy hesitated. Just one heartbeat. "Of course," she said. "We have worked with attorneys." "I am asking whether you read it carefully," I said, setting the papers down. "Do you know when that easement expires?" Her smile wavered. "Those agreements usually have automatic renewals." "Not this one," I said. "And you know it." Brandy stood up abruptly. Papers shifted inside the briefcase. "You are playing a dangerous game," she said, her voice rising. "You are holding the entire community hostage." I stood as well and looked her straight in the eye. "No. I am just no longer letting anyone pretend to own what they do not." End quote. "We have a giver discount." She left quickly, without a goodbye, without looking back. The door slammed shut behind her. That evening, I sat alone in the living room. Soft yellow light, washing over the maps, taped temporarily to the wall. I did not feel victorious. I felt responsibility, because when the truth is about to be revealed in front of everyone, it does not just bring down one person abusing power. It forces an entire community to confront how long it stayed silent. And I knew the real storm had not arrived yet. The deputy sheriff knocked on my door on a gray morning, holding a stack of papers thick enough to feel like an approaching storm. He stood there, polite but rigid, reading each line of a petition for a temporary restraining order. According to the filing, I was accused of stalking, harassing, and threatening the personal safety of Brandy Lockridge. I was portrayed as a dangerous recluse, using security cameras to spy, using legal documents to psychologically terrorize the community. When he finished, the wind swept across the porch, lightly rustling the papers in my hand. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. Brandy. A chill ran down my spine. Not from fear, from understanding. This was a desperate move. And desperate moves are usually dirty. I called Nina the moment the door closed. "She crossed the line," I said. Nina was silent for a beat. I figured. She is trying to control the narrative before the truth comes out. The hearing was scheduled for Friday afternoon. I arrived at the courthouse early, sitting on a cold wooden bench, watching thin streaks of sunlight slip through the tall windows. In the waiting area, I saw Brandy. She wore a dark outfit, her hair neatly tied back, a thick binder clutched in her arms. Her face was calm, almost solemn, a woman perfectly playing the role of a victim. When we entered the courtroom, the judge was a middle-aged woman with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many neighbor disputes turn into wars. She asked Brandy to speak first. Brandy stood up. Her voice trembled slightly, just enough to sound fragile. She talked about fear, about feeling watched, about cameras pointed toward her home, about me using legal authority as a weapon to intimidate her and make other residents feel unsafe. She presented photos of cameras, copies of property documents marked with bright highlighter. She told a smooth, emotional story. I saw a few people in the room nod along. Then it was my turn. I stood up, feeling the solid wood floor beneath my feet. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell a story. I simply presented evidence. Nina placed the original contract in front of the judge. The boundary maps, the HOA financial records, expenditures for the community center, the playground, the retention pond, all located on my land. Nina played a short video. Brandy at night, spray paint in hand, erasing survey markers. The room went silent. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "I am not stalking her. I am protecting my property. I am not threatening the community. I discovered that the community has been operating for years on private land without legal rights." The judge read for a long time. She turned page after page. She looked at Brandy, then at me. Her expression shifted from patient to sharp. "Miss Lockridge," the judge said slowly, "this is a civil dispute over land use and contract rights. You are attempting to reframe it as a personal safety issue." Brandy opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "The petition for a restraining order is denied," the judge said, "and I strongly suggest the parties resolve this matter through proper legal channels." The gavel struck. Short. Final. In the hallway, Brandy stopped me. Tears glistened at the corners of her eyes, but her gaze was empty. "Caleb," she said, her voice breaking, "this is tearing the community apart. We can negotiate." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the years of silence from neighbors, the citations, the quiet threats. "The community was broken a long time ago," I replied. "Not by the truth, but by fear." She turned away and walked quickly toward the parking lot. I stayed where I was, taking a deep breath. I knew Brandy would not stop. People like her rarely accept defeat quietly, but I also knew something else. She had just lost the most important thing in this entire game: credibility. And when credibility cracks, false authority collapses faster than any contract ever could. I left the courthouse with a heavy but clear feeling. The final storm was coming, and this time, it would unfold in front of everyone. That morning, the smell of grilled meat drifted through Cedar Ridge before Brandy Lockridge realized her power was about to end. I stood beside my old grill, flipping sizzling cuts of meat under the gentle sunlight. The front yard slowly filled with familiar faces I had not truly seen in a long time. Faces I had only glimpsed through curtains. Children ran across the playground, the same one that had once been neglected and cracked. Adults gathered in small clusters, speaking carefully, as if afraid to break something fragile. They came because of a simple invitation: a community gathering. No slogans, no arguments, just a chance to hear the truth. Town officials arrived shortly before noon. A county commissioner and a district supervisor, both wearing the cautious expressions of people who had heard too many neighbor disputes turn into disasters. A local reporter stood off to the side, notebook ready. Then Brandy arrived. Her luxury car stopped at the gate, followed by a young police officer she had called under the pretense of maintaining order. Brandy stepped out, a thick briefcase in hand, her eyes scanning the crowd as if this were still her stage. "This gathering violates community standards," she said loudly, her familiar commanding tone cutting through the air. "This area is under the authority of the Homeowners Association." The noise around us faded. I set the grill spatula down, wiped my hands on a towel, and stepped forward. "Before we talk about standards," I said, my voice carrying just far enough, "everyone should know whose land they are standing on." I held up the survey map, the boundary lines clear and unmistakable, marked in the same color the entire neighborhood had grown used to seeing over the past weeks. I then placed the old contract on the table, the paper yellowed with age, but the signature still bold. 25 years ago," I said, "my grandfather granted temporary use of part of this land to build community facilities. That usage came with a time limit, with conditions, and those conditions have been violated for years." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw Lynn Tran cover her mouth. Eli Rivera tightened his grip on his son's shoulder. Tessa Park looked toward Brandy, fear no longer in her eyes. The county commissioner stepped forward, took the documents, and read quickly. His expression changed. "Are you saying the Homeowners Association has been operating these facilities on private land without legal rights?" "Yes," I answered. "And they have spent a significant amount of residents' money on property they do not own." The young police officer looked at Brandy. "Ma'am," he asked, "do you have documentation proving ownership?" Brandy opened her briefcase and searched frantically. Papers slid out and fell to the ground like dry leaves. She bent down to gather them, her hands trembling slightly. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Everyone knows this is common property." "With 3 Danes. Knowing," I replied, "does not make it true." The air broke open. People began asking questions about HOA fees, about repair budgets, about warning letters and fines. The reporter wrote non-stop. I presented the formal notice: 30 days to correct the violations or pay the penalties outlined in the contract. 60 days to renegotiate or prepare for removal when the usage rights expired. Brandy stood there, the briefcase useless in her hands. For the first time, she seemed small in the middle of the crowd. 2 days later, her resignation email was sent. Short, cold, no apology. A new board was elected quickly. The people who had once stayed silent began to speak. We sat down together, no shouting, no threats. A fair lease agreement was signed. Penalties were waived in exchange for transparency and respect. The playground was repaired. The retention pond was cleaned. The orange flags were removed. 3 months later, I used the lease income to start a small fund for kids who wanted to learn a trade. My grandfather used to say, "A community is strongest when there are people who know how to fix what is broken." One afternoon, I sat on my porch watching children play basketball. Lynn Tran brought over pastries. The smell of food drifted through the air, and no one complained anymore. I thought about power. It does not live in giving orders. It lives in taking responsibility. If you have ever lived in a neighborhood where your voice was silenced, share your story. Leave a comment about your experience. Press like if this story made you think, and subscribe so you do not miss more stories about how truth can change an entire community.